On the winter nights of 1811, the father and mother of little Stephen died. It was a small, happy family, but poor. Unfortunately, fate was very cruel to little Stephen. Stephen's life was stable until his mother fell ill, and his father did not find any treatment for her. Only a few months later, Stephen's mother died of the severity of the disease, and it seems that Stephen's father could not bear life without her, so he died as well. When the people of the village where Stephen lived learned what had happened, they felt very sad for him, especially since they knew that Stephen's family was not rich, and therefore Stephen's parents did not leave him any money that he could use to help him in life or provide him with his basic needs. His father's friend, Uncle Tom, was the one who took care of Stephen during that difficult period. After the situation improved a little, Stephen told him that he would go to his father's cousin, Mr. Abney. The news was not good for Uncle Tom, especially since he knows that this man is a stranger and does not like receiving guests and does not want to live except to stay alone with the books and music he prefers. But Sven insisted on going because Mr. Abney is now his only family, and he does not know anyone else except him who can go to him, especially since the house in which Stephen lives is rented, and soon its owner will demand rent from Stephen. Of course, Stephen does not have any money that he can pay for his stay in the house. Stephen began gathering his things from the house: his clothes, his study books, his tools, the important belongings of his father and mother, and he picked himself up and went to Lincolnshire, where Asurabi Hall was. It was a huge, long house that seemed to have been built a long time ago. The moonlight was reflecting on the house, which made the house shine. There was a garden full of trees, and next to the house there was a church with a large clock. The city was completely different from the village in which Stephen grew up. That is why the boy felt excited and enjoyed. Stephen rang the doorbell and waited for the door to open. Minutes later, Mr. Abney himself came to open the door. He was surprised by this child standing at the door. Immediately, Stephen began to introduce himself to Mr. Abney, who he was and where he came from. Despite Uncle Tom's warnings about Mr. Abney, he did not like to receive guests, or he loves children in general, but Stephen found a very warm welcome from Mr. Abney, who began asking Stephen questions. "How old are you, my son? How are you? I hope you are not too tired to eat your dinner." Stephen replied, "I am fine, sir. I'm absolutely fine." Mr. Abney said, "Good. Why didn't you tell me how old you are?" Stephen felt strange why this man was asking his age with such insistence. He asked 3 times in less than 2 minutes, but he answered him, "I am 12 years old on my next birthday." Then Mr. Abney asked again, "When is your next birthday, my dear boy?" "On the 11th of September, said Stephen. Mr. Abney replied with great enthusiasm, "That's good, very good." When he felt that Stephen was looking at him strangely, he continued, "I just like to write these things in my book. Are you sure?" "Yes, sir, sure," Stephen replied again. Mr. Abney got his servant ready and asked him to take Stephen to Mr. Punch's room, saying, "Take him to Mrs. Punch's room, Parks, and let him have his dinner." Then he looked at Stephen and said, "Don't worry, Mrs. Punch is a gentle lady. She's good and will help you a lot." Stephen went up with Mr. Abney's servant, Parks, to Mrs. Punch's room, and there he met her. He felt that she was a very friendly lady and felt comfortable with her. He even felt that they were good friends in less than a quarter of an hour. Mrs. Punch was 55 years old and was the manager of the house. She knew everything about Mr. Abney's house, all the neighboring houses, and the whole area. She loved talking to Stephen and sharing a lot of information with him about the house, the garden, and the church. Stephen was excited because he really wanted to know all that information. While Mrs. Punch was talking to Stephen, the door knocked and Mr. Abney entered, who spoke to Mrs. Punch, saying, "How is it? This child is Stephen Elliott. He is my relative, and I want you to take good care of him." Mrs. Punch smiled and assured Mr. Abney that everything would be fine. Stephen spent most of his time with Mrs. Punch, who talked to him a lot, and they both had a good time. She also helped him study. Mrs. Punch had never been married and had no children, so she loved young children and was careful to treat them tenderly. On November, while Seven was sitting with her before going to sleep as usual, a question came to his mind. He looked at Mrs. Bunch, who was knitting him a wool scarf, and said to her, "Is Mr. Abney a good man?" Mrs. Punch said to him, "My son, Mr. Abney is the kindest man I have ever known. He does a lot of serious things. Did I not tell you before about the child he brought here 7 years ago? Or about the little girl he brought? That was only 2 years after I had worked in this house." Stephen replied in astonishment, "No, you have never told me before. Please tell me about them, Mrs. Punch." Mrs. Bunn said, "Well, I don't remember much about the little girl. It was a long time ago." Mr. Abney brought her home and asked Mrs. Alice, his late wife, to take care of her. She was poor and did not have any family. That is why Mr. Abney decided to give her a family and a home, and indeed the girl came and sat at home with us for 3 weeks. Almost one day we woke up and did not find her. It seemed that she left while everyone was sleeping. We do not know where she went. We have not seen her since that day. But Mr. Abney searched for her everywhere for a long period of time. But unfortunately, he was unable to find her. She was a quiet child, silent most of the time, but she helped me a lot in taking care of the house and was obedient, and I loved her very much. The sadness was clearly visible on Mrs. Punch's face. Then Stephen asked her again, "What about the little boy?" Mrs. Punch said, "Oh, that poor fellow was so poor. He loved to play music, and he came home one winter's day, so Mr. Abney allowed him to stay here at the house. Mr. Abney talked to him a lot and asked him about many things. Where did he come from? How old was he? And where was his family?" Here, Mr. Abney learned that this child lost his family at a young age and that he moved between more than one orphanage until he recently escaped from them and learned music and began playing in the streets for money. He was Mr. Abney, very kind to this child, but unfortunately he also disappeared like the girl. We woke up one day and could not find him. We all searched for him, especially Mr. Abney, but we could not find him. Stephen listened intently to Mrs. Punch's speech and felt that there was something familiar in her conversation about the girl and the boy, but he could not determine what this thing was. Then he asked Mrs. Punch to excuse him to go to his room, and he actually went to his room to sleep. The day was exhausting. Stephen was feeling sleepy, so as soon as he lay down on his bed, he fell asleep. That night, Stephen had a strange dream. He dreamed that he left his room and went to the upper part of the house. There was an old bathroom in this part. No one was using it. The door of this bathroom is made of glass, so those standing outside can see those inside. During the dream, Stephen saw himself standing in front of this glass door and saw through it the body of someone in the bathroom. This person is very thin and has a sad smile on his face. His hand was where his heart was, and he was pressing it. Then this person looked at Stephen, and the smile turned into a terrifying smile, and then this person's arms began to move in Stephen's direction. Here, Stephen felt very frightened and suddenly woke up. To his surprise, when Stephen woke up, he found himself in front of the bathroom door. The floor was cold, and Stephen did not understand how he had gotten to this place, but he quickly composed himself and decided to look through the glass to see if this person was really inside, as he had seen in his dream, or not. Stephen looked and did not find anything, so he returned to his bed again. In the morning, at the breakfast table, Stephen, Mrs. Punch, and Mr. Abney sat and listened to the strange dream that Stephen had last night. Mrs. Punch was clearly afraid. As for Mr. Abney, he showed great concern. Mrs. Punch said, "Don't be afraid, Stephen. I will put up a curtain on the glass door, and the dream will never happen again." As for Mr. Abney, he said, "This is exciting, Stephen. I will write about this dream in my book." The following days and months passed safely. Spring approached, and in the meantime, 2 strange things happened. The first was that Stephen had another very strange and disturbed night. He was unable to sleep well, and in the morning he saw his nightgown in Mrs. Punch's hand. She was mending it, and she looked angry. As soon as she saw Stephen, she asked him, "How did you manage to tear your nightgown so badly? It will take me a long time to be able to repair it." Stephen did not understand what Mrs. Punch was saying, so he approached to see the shirt and saw that the shirt was already torn. He cut the shirt in more than one place, and each cut was a few inches long. Stephen didn't understand what had happened, but he looked at Mrs. Punch and told her, "I don't remember how it happened. I don't remember anything, but it looks exactly like the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door." Mrs. Punch looked at him with open mouth and then ran upstairs to Stephen's room. Stephen ran after her. Mrs. Punch arrived and looked at the scratches and said, "Well, it's very strange. How could those scratches happen? They're so high." "No, it could be a cat, a dog, or even a mouse." Stephen nodded in confirmation of her words, and then Mrs. Punch continued her speech, saying, "Don't say anything to Mr. Abney, and remember to lock your door when you go to sleep tonight." Stephen replied, "Oh, I always do that." The next evening, the second strange thing happened when Stephen and Mrs. Punch were sitting in the living room. Mrs. Punch was sitting in front of the door, knitting some things, and Stephen was sitting in the corner of the room reading a book. Then Mr. Parks, Mr. Abney's servant, entered, and he looked upset. He was so nervous and afraid that he did not notice Stephen when he entered the room and said nervously, "Mr. Abney will have to get his own wine, especially in the evening. I am not going down there at night. There's something very strange going on downstairs, you know? It could be wind or mice, but I don't think so, and I don't like to say what it might be. It could be wind or mice, but I don't think so, and I don't like to say what it might be." Mrs. Punch looked at Mr. Parks warningly. "Don't talk like that. You'll frighten young Stephen." Suddenly, Mr. Parks noticed Stephen for the first time, and his face quickly changed into a wary smile. "Oh, I was just joking, you know," he repeated, but Stephen knew deep down that he wasn't joking, and he felt anxiety took over him. From that day on, he began asking Mr. Parks a lot of questions about the house. He was deliberately asking him about the noise coming from under the house, but Mr. Parks refused to answer and changed the course of the conversation. Stephen was smart and read a lot of books. Those books taught him to think about everything that was said in front of him, to scrutinize the details, and not to ignore any danger sign. This is exactly what Stephen felt. He was careful to close his room well in the evening and not to go out, except in the morning after everyone had woken up. And he was thinking a lot about what Parks had said and what might be the reason behind that noise, and why a big adult man like Mr. Parks would be afraid to go down to the wine cellar. Is he afraid of something? And what is it that he doesn't like to talk about? All these questions were storming the mind of little Stephen, but he knew that he would not find any answers from any of the residents of the house. On March 24th, 1812, the evening had come, and the atmosphere was very strange. Spring was approaching, and yet the weather was stormy and noisy. Stephen was standing in the garden at that time, feeling afraid. He felt that there were ghosts surrounding him from every direction, as if there were people watching him, but he could not see them. He just felt them flying around him, as if they wanted to deliver a certain message to him. The weather was cold, and Stephen heard Mrs. Punch asking him to come in for dinner. Stephen actually entered and began eating dinner slowly. There were many thoughts occupying his mind, and after, when he finished dinner, Mr. Punch spoke to him, saying, "Stephen, my son, I would like you to come to my office late today. I want you to come today at 11 o'clock. Stephen said, "Is something wrong?" Mr. Abney tried to reassure him, saying, "Don't worry, I just want to talk to you about your future life and what you are planning for." Stephen smiled and stood up to leave the room, but Mr. Abney stopped him, saying, "Okay, Stephen, don't tell Mrs. Punch or anyone in the house with what we talked about. Go to your room at the usual time and come to my office at 11. Don't forget." Stephen nodded and left enthusiastically. He felt happy that he would be allowed to stay up that night. He could spend his time reading and perhaps drawing. Stephen spent the time remaining until his normal bedtime. At the appointed time for bed, he went to his room without saying anything, and then he looked inside Mr. Abney's office. The office was empty, and on the table there was a silver cup filled with red wine and a piece of paper that seemed to belong to Mr. Abney, but it looked a bit old. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, Stephen stood in front of the open window of his room and was looking at the darkness outside. The wind had calmed down a little and was no longer so strong as it had been. The moon was full and looked very beautiful. Stephen was looking at this scene with great admiration when suddenly he heard some strange screams. He said to himself, "What is this? Has something happened to someone? Or is it the sound of water birds into the lake that the garden overlooks?" The sound gradually rose as if it was approaching the house, and then it stopped. Then Stephen approached the window. He tried to close it so he could go back to reading again. He saw two children standing in the garden outside under the dark trees, a boy and a girl. They were standing together and looking at Stephen's window. The girl looked like the person that Stephen had seen in his dream before in the bathroom. She was smiling and placing her hand on her heart, while the boy was clearly frightened. His hair was black and untidy. His clothes were old, and he was desperately extending his hand forward. His nails looked very long and dirty. Stephen tried to look closely at the boy and the girl, and then he felt that he could not believe what he was seeing. There was a large black hole on the left side of the boy's chest, and then the children started screaming in terror and fear again. They were terrible and sad screams. Then both children disappeared. Stephen felt very frightened, but he found that it was nearly 11 o'clock, and therefore he must set off to go to Mr. Abney's office. Everyone was asleep at this time, and most of the rooms in the house were dark and calm and silence. Stephen did not see any of the servants. When he arrived at Mr. Abney's office, he did not open the door. The door was not closed, and the key was in the door from the outside. When Steve knocked on the office door, he did not find any response, but he heard Mr. Abney's voice. He was talking. No, he was screaming. Stephen felt curious. Why is Mr. Abney screaming? Can Mr. Abney see strange children too? Suddenly, everything became quiet, and he could not hear Mr. Abney's voice. And he found that the office door opened on its own. Stephen entered the room and found Mr. Abney slumped in his chair. His head was thrown back, and his eyes were wide open. He had a look of terrible fear and pain on his face. Stephen looked down and found that the left side of his chest was pierced. When Stephen looked at the hole, he did not find the heart, and on the desk in front of Mr. Abney, there was a long, sharp knife, but it was completely clean, and Mr. Abney's hands were also completely clean. Stephen felt the sting of the air and looked in the direction of the window to find it open, and the curtains were shaking in the wind as if they were dancing a terrible dance. Stephen looked again at Mr. Abney's table and found a book that seemed to be old. The book was open to a certain page, so Stephen picked it up and began reading. What was written in the book was as follows: "You can control the world. You can fly. You can disappear. You can become someone or something else. All of that through magic. But in order to be able to use magic, you must first obtain 3 hearts. 3 hearts for young people. They must be less than 21 years old." A sheet of paper fell from the book, so Stephen picked it up and began to read what was on it. It was the same paper that he had seen before next to the cup on Mr. Abney's desk. It was in Mr. Abney's own handwriting, which wrote, "I spent 20 years of my life selecting 3 young men. I was looking for young men whom I could kill without anyone noticing their disappearance. The killing process began on March 24th, 1791, and the first victim was Phoebe Stanley, a quiet little girl who did not speak much. She has no family and no one will miss her. As for the second one, he was an Italian boy named Giovanni Paoli. He loved music and played in the streets. This was on the 23rd of March, 1805, and tonight will be the date of killing the last child. Tonight, the 24th of March, 1812, the last child will be my cousin Stephen Elliott. He has no family but me, and no one will look for him. I will tell the servants that he ran away from home like Giovanni and Phoebe, and they will not ask much. I will kill him and bury him, and no one will be able to find the bodies of the 3 children. I hid Giovanni and Phoebe in the underground wine cellar, and tonight is the time for Stephen to be buried next to them." Mr. Abney's handwriting trembled as he wrote his last sentence. "God, the ghosts of the children are back again. They enter my office and scream in terror and tell me while they are crying terribly, we will get the heart of the man who killed us. But this will not happen to me, I am sure." Those were Mr. Abney's last words. Stephen finished reading and looked at Mr. Abney's body calmly. Then he left the room and closed the door. In the morning, Mr. Parks discovered Mr. Abney's body, and the whole house woke up to his screams. When the police came, they confirmed that the window must have been open, that Mr. Abney was killed by a wild cat. No one questioned this explanation, but only Stephen knew what happened, and he knew that Mr. Abney had received his just punishment. Stephen was Mr. Abney's only legal heir, and he saw the strange children every year on the night of the 24th of March. Until Stephen turned 18, he decided to remove the children's bodies from the cellar and give them a proper burial. Only then did Stephen stop seeing the children.